Hello, everyone, and welcome to Equals and a Happy New Year from us. This is Nabil.
Hi, guys. This is Nadia. We are excited to be back in 2023, and we are thrilled today to be welcoming the one and only Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Nabil, it is a busy, busy week for Oxfam, drawing attention to the extreme inequality we're seeing today as the world's richest are descending into Davos for the World Economic Forum.
Yes, absolutely. The Festival of Wealth, that is Davos, is back. Although, if you look at the pictures, the snow is a little missing, and that's another story unto
Mm.
itself. But look, our new data out this week, it shows that the 1% have captured nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of us, and 99% of us combined at the start of this decade. And that's extraordinary
Mm.
when you think about it. You can almost imagine a sign outside Davos that reads, "Welcome to the new Roaring Twenties."
Gosh, and I mean, what's just as alarming is how this extreme wealth that you just referenced and extreme poverty are rising at the same time, and that's happening for the first time in 25 years. I mean, we're seeing countries struggling with debt, with climate, with so many crises, and then at the same time, the rich are getting richer.
Absolutely. And look, today's episode gets us into the state of inequality right across the globe. And there's literally nobody better to do that with than Joe Stiglitz.
That's true. I mean, he is the guru on inequality, Nobel laureate, leader on so many of the important issues of our day. I would say he's an influencer of influencers.
There's a life goal there, influencer of influencers. Nice phrase,
Absolutely.
Nadia. But talk of someone who doesn't need an introduction, and I think people will just want to hear what he has to say.
That's true. Okay, let's get on with it. But just before we do, I do notice that you keep saying Joe, and to me he's Professor Stiglitz. So what are we going with, Joe
Uh,
or Prof Stiglitz?
I mean, he is Professor Stiglitz, but I think we can call him Joe.
Okay,
Let's get to it.
okay, let's do it.
Joe, a very, very warm welcome onto Oxfam's Equals podcast. It's so great to have you on, knowing your work. And I'm sure you get this a lot, but just even walking into this podcast, as I walked past my bookcase, I saw globalization and its discontents. I think the book that got me into all of this, I saw Free Fall, Price of Inequality. So it's always great to someone who's taught us all so much.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Joe, I'm equally just so excited to have this conversation and really grateful that you're making the time. I want to get right into it and ask about inequality because that's the topic of the day and on the state of economic inequality. That's what I want to ask about. Oxfam's just put out our Davos report, and again, we see these shocking figures on wealth accumulation. There's been soaring increases in food and energy prices. And I wonder, from your perspective, how serious is the state of economic inequality?
Well, first, let me say I always look forward to your annual report. You put things so viscerally. I remember one of the earlier reports you talked about you could put half the wealth of the world in a bus. And then a couple of years later, you said, well, you don't need a bus, you could have a minivan. Well, what's happened since COVID-19 has been extraordinary. The COVID-19 both exposed global inequalities and exacerbated them. And your inequality report focuses on the top. And, in a period where so many people found life so difficult with losing their jobs, now in the post-pandemic era, dealing with inflation, food prices, oil prices going up. It is shocking how many people and how our rich corporations have made off like bandits. The increase in wealth is just phenomenal. A couple of numbers from your report. The richest 1% grab nearly 2/3 of all new wealth, worth $42 trillion created since 2020, almost twice as much money as the bottom 99% of the world's population. So that is, just an astounding number. So every time I read one of these reports, I think, well, clearly, uh, things have to get better, but the pandemic and the post-pandemic world has just made things worse. The example that I find most outrageous was while so many around the world were facing high oil prices, the oil companies and gas companies were raking in tens of billions of dollars that they were paying in share buybacks and one-time dividends and so forth. When proposals were made to maybe share the wealth with a tax on these windfall gains, they hadn't done anything to deserve it. Putin did.
Right.
If we were, the source of that particular profit was Putin's war in Ukraine. I would call that war profiteering. And in the old days, you used to execute those who engaged in war profiteering. But when it was proposed that there would be a windfall profits tax just on the extra tax, the head of Exxon said no way and fought against it.
Yeah, you're so right, Joe. And look, I have to ask you, Joe, here as well. In this moment, right? I remember that feeling after the global financial crash. I remember you writing "Of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%" for Vanity Fair, which was a real moment in itself. And how do you feel this moment right now compares to that? There are even some talk here in the US, Joe, of some people thinking maybe things are getting a little bit better. Actually, how do you respond to that?
It's a mixed bag, to be frank. There was a moment in 2021, right after Biden took office, and the American Recovery Act was passed. It succeeded in reducing childhood poverty in 1 year by 40% or 40 to 50%. That's phenomenal. Something that I've been saying for a long time. Inequality is a choice. We could have reduced that childhood poverty by 44, 50% anytime we wanted to. We had the money to do it if we wanted to. But it took a person like President Biden, and it took a moment like the pandemic to get our act together. But then the Republicans, even and some of the Democrats, the forces on the other side said, "Great, let's have more inequality." I mean, I couldn't believe it, and we're putting in jeopardy our future because children who grow up in poverty are not going to be as productive. They're going to be discontent. It's going to have adverse effects on our politics and our society and our economy. It is foolish, I believe, to have so many of our children grow up in poverty. And yet, almost consciously, those on the right said, we want more childhood poverty. To give you one more example, I've been finding it amazing that the Fed has been saying we want to increase the unemployment rate. And then they go on to say, Powell says, it's going to take a lot of pain. Of course, he's not going to be feeling the pain. I know he's going to say it's going to be painful for me to see your pain, but it's very different from him experiencing the pain. And one of the things that we know, it seems like a small thing, increasing the unemployment rate, say from 3.7% to 5.1%, 5.2%. Those seem like just numbers, but they're real people. And when you do that, the unemployment rate on, say, marginalized groups, on young African American, is not going to be 5.1%. It's going to be around 20%. And what does that do to our society?
Joe, you mentioned choices here, and one of the choices that we can make to combat extreme inequality is on taxing the ultra wealthy. And I want to go there because it feels to me that in many respects, the world's moved on from asking maybe if we should tax the rich to an increasing debate on how much we should tax the rich. And the US has such an interesting history here. The most progressive tax system in the world in the past. FDR right to the early 80s, top earners, an average at the top, marginal income tax rate above 80%. If I was to ask you, Joe, what's your sense here? What do you think is the right rate to tax the ultra wealthy, specifically billionaires, in today's era?
I think we have to realize that to some extent, most of the billionaires have gotten much of their wealth out of luck. They did something positive, they created something, but there were other people doing similar things. Take Facebook, there was MySpace. One of them was going to win, it was a lottery. And you can say, well, they came up with a better idea of clicking like. That was a big innovation, but is it worth 50 billion or 100 or 150 billion dollars? But uh, the real point is, would they have done it anyway if instead of having $100 billion, they only took home $5 billion? My view is what drives a lot of this is the drive to create, drive to be successful. And if you took away a large fraction of the wealth uh, that they get beyond $5 or $10 billion, they still would have done it. And what reinforces my view on the fact that we ought to have high tax rates on the very wealthy is that most of these have, not all, have gotten at least a fraction of their wealth out of exploitation, a variety of kinds of exploitation. Sometimes it's just exploitation of market power. Microsoft was accused of violating competition laws on 3 continents. Google has been, Amazon has been, and in most cases they've been found guilty. So there is an unsavory aspect of it. Some of the billionaires, like Trump, actually are explicitly exploitive, lying, cheating with their contractors, making money out of gambling addiction, and so forth. So to me, the kinds of proposals that have been put forward in the United States by, say, Elizabeth Warren, a wealth tax of 1% or 3% over 50 billion, or over 5 billion, or those numbers seem to be very reasonable and would really go a long way to raising revenues that could alleviate some of our country's problems. Let me make it clear: it's not that we're trying to be against success. It's really a question of sharing the wealth in ways to make our society function better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Joe, I do want to push you on that, just thinking about the top earners specifically and a top marginal rate. I mean, we have seen it up to 80% in the past. Is that realistic today, getting up to those kinds of percents?
There have been calculations done by some of the top public finance economists where they carefully look at the trade-offs. People at the top might work a little bit less if you tax them more, but on the other hand, our society gains in having a more egalitarian, a more cohesive society. And I think the general consensus is on labor income that a tax rate of 70% would clearly make sense. Maybe a little higher. I don't want to fine tune it too much, but what we're talking here, though, is more about wealth taxes.
Yeah.
And the irony is that while, in my view, we should be taxing wealth at a higher rate, because much of the wealth is inherited wealth.
Yeah.
The young Walmarts inherited their wealth. One of my friends describes it as winning the sperm lottery. They chose the right parents, and you say, well, why should they have more wealth? So I think there's a compelling case that wealth should be taxed at a higher rate,
Yeah.
especially at the very top. And in the United States, if you pass on assets to your children, you can escape capital gains tax totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, lots of work to be done on capital gains tax. And actually, I want to ask you, when we think about billionaires, we think about a lot of concentration of wealth. We think about the Elon Musks of the world and the Bill Gates of the world, and at the same time, there's a huge concentration of wealth also in low and middle income countries, right? It's not just
That's right.
these white men in the global north. There is a huge concentration of wealth in other countries as well. And so I do want to ask, is that also feasible? And we're seeing these mountains of debt payments accumulating in low and middle income countries, and the solution is this drive towards austerity. When you have these choked budgets, governments are just moving towards austerity, obviously pushed for by the elite and then also by the IMF as this huge dominant external force. But how much is there as an alternative to austerity? How much scope is there to tax the rich and tax wealth in those kinds of countries?
Oh, I think there's enormous scope. One of the things that the international community has to do, of course, is close the tax havens. A lot of the
Mm.
wealth escapes. Um, Big countries, US, EU, India, China, if they wanted to have the power really to effectively shut down these. And the billionaire, there's been enormous growth of billionaires in China and in India. And those countries, if they wanted to, could clearly make the um, uh, those who do business in their country uh, pay do like we do in the United States. We say that your income is taxed no matter where you make that income. We don't do it perfectly, and we ought to do it more. But having global reach is really important, and other countries haven't done that. And I think that's an important lesson. But not a surprise. It's a hidden form of corruption. A lot of studies have shown that it is political connections that drive a lot of the wealth accumulation in developing countries and emerging markets.
Right. And thinking about how these decisions get made in international spaces, I actually want to move the conversation towards there and towards multilateralism. You were such a tremendous force in the discussion on vaccines during the COVID-19 pandemic. Have worked so much on international tax reform, and in so many of these multilateral discussions, we've seen poor countries almost literally locked out of the room on decisions. And then at the end of the day, getting a very, very raw deal. And I wonder, from your perspective, in today's era, I mean, it blows my mind that we still have such, this neo-colonial dynamic almost. How do we shift that dynamic?
That's a really good question. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's been a greater effort to have what they call inclusive frameworks on the tax, but they're in the room, but not being listened to. The conversations are structured in ways that the voice of the poor and the voices of the poor countries are effectively not heard. And you see that in the outcome of the OECD initiative on tax reform.
Yeah.
It was, they wouldn't even disclose how much extra money the developing countries were going to get. And we know why, because those who did preliminary calculations said they're getting a pittance. So the question you ask is the right one. How do we change that? There is a new geopolitics that is emerging. Uh, During the Cold War, there was a kind of rivalry for the hearts and minds of those in the third world. Then, at the end of the Cold War, in the late 80s, uh, there was that competition disappeared. We're entering an era of a new Cold War, and we're seeing, in a sense, a failure of of the West. For me, when I look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I find it, so outrageous, and it is a disappointment to me that there hasn't been the kind of support that I would have liked to have seen from developing countries and emerging markets. But I understand their anger. They said, when we were dying with COVID-19, you said you wouldn't even allow us to have the intellectual property, share the intellectual property, and you still won't share that intellectual property. So you're putting your profits of Pfizer and Moderna above our lives. And now there's this war in Europe, and we're paying the price of higher food and higher oil prices, and you expect us to support you in this. So I understand that anger, and then they say, look at, then you conduct your monetary policy in ways that result in our having to pay higher interest rates, our having to pay the dollar, and much of our debt is in dollars, increasing in value. And then you're telling us we have to have austerity because otherwise we won't be able to pay back our debts. So
Yeah.
I understand that kind of anger, but maybe the answer to your question is the new realities of the new Cold War will force the US and Europe to begin paying more attention to the developing countries and the emerging markets.
It's a profound answer, Joe, and I feel we should. I feel we could talk all day about this, and what you say really relates also to what we hear from folks we work with right across the world. Joe, we could spend all day with you, but conscious of your time, I want to get to a final question here. And there's bleak pictures here right across, what we've been discussing today, and so much that goes on. And if I could just ask you on a personal note, taking a step back from the policies, taking a wider lens on things, you've led the world to address inequality. Sometimes this fight, it does feel quite hard. Sometimes you want to stay in bed for that bit longer in the morning thinking today's going to be a tough day. What keeps you going, Joe, to keep fighting for a more equal world?
Well, I just, personally, I just can't accept a world with a kind of social injustice that we see. I don't think I could sleep at night if I felt I weren't doing what I could do uh, to help create a better world. And on the positive side, I think there has been progress. Uh, Sometimes I feel like it's two steps forward and then one step back. We've been criticizing IMF and its austerity, but when I wrote Globalization and Its Discontents, I think things were much worse. Beginning with Strauss-Kahn and Christine Lagarde, and now with Kristalina as the head of the IMF. There is more focus on inequality. There's been a recognition that capital controls may be a better way of running capital markets in the midst of a crisis. There's a recognition that austerity hurts and is not the way to promote even paying debts, let alone growth. There are new views on how to deal with technical issues like debt sustainability. The Washington Consensus framework is no longer consensus, even within the IMF. No, I don't want to say it's unmitigated victory. I said it's two steps forward, one step back. And maybe I'm too much of a student of the Enlightenment, where I believe in progress, uh, reasoned progress. If you put the arguments forward, some of the time reason works.
Yeah.
As we know. But I come to this from a fairly academic perspective. I very much believe in Enlightenment values, and I have to believe that if we reason together, we get out the facts. Um, you might say it's reason plus the moral goodness, the
Yeah.
empathy that Adam Smith talked about in the theory of moral sentiments will lead us in the right direction.
Well, on that note, I'm smiling, during a tough week of thinking about the state of the world, but I'm smiling at the end of this interview, and I am hopeful. Joe, this has been such a treat. You're so inspiring, energizing as ever. I'm truly grateful that you took the time with us today. Thank you.
Embracing that moral goodness, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My goodness, how do we get this man on every single Equals episode, right?
It was a wonderful interview. We covered a lot of ground. It was sharp. It was powerful. It was humbling. I've got to tell you, Nadia, I was deeply moved by Joe's answer about, what gets him up in the morning every day.
I know I could tell you were getting emotional there at the end, and I mean he really is a force. But yeah, I was trying to distill all of what he was saying into what are the three key messages, and here's what I took away. Number one, inequality is dangerously high, but it's also a policy choice, and so it's not inevitable. Just looking at the examples from the U.S. that he was giving. Number two, taxing top earners and their wealth has to be part of the solution to extreme inequality. And thirdly, the need to fundamentally shift global power dynamics, and not just for the sake of economics and poverty and inequality, but also for the sake of politics and peace.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful 3-point summary, Nadia. And look, his point about rich nations as well, crushing countries across the global south one day and then asking their support for the next. There's a dangerous dissonance there that we need to call out. But my biggest reflection listening to Joe was perhaps not on something he said, but something that I think he embodied and has always has. And that's on the moral responsibility of economists. And, when Joe said these aren't just numbers when we're talking about unemployment, these are people. If only more folks across policymaking thought like that, I wonder where we'd be today.
Seriously, and I mean, I think we'd be in a very different place. Okay, everyone. Well, we are going to have to wrap up this incredible episode. Thank you for listening, and please, please do share it with friends, with family, with colleagues. Thank you.
Yes, let's get the word out there about inequality and what we can do about it. Thanks for listening, everyone. Cheers.